A City of Hate, a Bernard Miller story, Part 1. Kevin O'Brien and Ryan Walsh rode the #1 train to Canal Street, their minds set on finding someone to unleash their twisted rage upon. The source of their anger: Kevin's sister had started seeing a Jewish man, something that infuriated him beyond reason. These two young men, barely in their 20s, had been radicalized in the hate-fueled circles of underground skinhead groups. They wore their hatred on their sleeves, literally, covered in tattoos that screamed their violent ideology. The two were dressed in dark hoodies and black jeans, faces hidden beneath hoods, heads freshly shaved. The stink of alcohol and marijuana clung to them as they swaggered from one subway car to another, the aggression boiling inside them. Kevin, the older of the two, spat on the floor as they stepped into a new car. "Can you believe this shit? Of all nights, not a Jew in sight," he sneered. "My sister must have lost her damn mind, dating one of those kikes. The world's going to hell." Ryan snorted in agreement, his voice dripping with venom. "I can't stand Jews, but at least they're better than those blacks. Spooks do nothing but rob, steal, and spread their diseases. We ought to lock 'em all up and throw away the key." Kevin smirked at his friend, his hate-filled eyes scanning the emptying subway car. "Damn straight, can't stand the sight of 'em. Look at us, roaming the streets, and not a single Jew or black to punish. What's this world coming to?" The two skinheads reached the end of the train and finally spotted someone. An African-American man sprawled across a row of seats, his face obscured by his tattered jacket. His clothes were grimy, his hands clutching a brown paper bag that unmistakably held some cheap liquor. His body sagged in the seat, intoxicated and unaware of the danger closing in. Ryan hesitated for a second, not sure if the figure was even human in the dim light. "What the fuck is that?" he asked, taking a step back, his voice a mixture of confusion and disgust. Kevin, emboldened by the stench of alcohol and the thrill of impending violence, let out a cruel laugh. "Well, look what the cat dragged in. A useless, stinking piece of shit. Just another drunk-ass nigger." His face twisted into a grotesque smile as the two of them moved closer. The train's lights flickered, casting brief shadows across the car, and that was their signal. Without hesitation, Kevin and Ryan launched their brutal attack. Kicks, punches, and jeers rained down on the helpless man. He stirred from his drunken stupor only to be met with the full force of their fists. His cries of pain went unanswered as the train rattled on. By the time they reached the next station, Hector Street, the man lay broken, bloody, and unconscious. The skinheads bolted from the train, sprinting to catch the Uptown 1 train back to 14th Street. As they ran, adrenaline pumping through their veins, they reveled in the thrill of their hate-fueled violence, leaving behind a man who wouldn't be found until the early rush hour of the next morning, lifeless and cold. Bernard Miller was awoken by the familiar sound of his 11-year-old son, Anthony, belting out Katy Perry's Roar from the bathroom. The boy had a new song every week, and he sang it with so much enthusiasm that it echoed through the house. His sister, Tasha, only a few months past 14, rolled her eyes at the noise. She had done the same thing at Anthony's age, so she never complained, though Bernard knew it grated on her nerves sometimes. Sitting up in bed, Bernard stretched and rubbed the sleep from his eyes. The sunlight sliced through the blinds, casting long shadows across the room. He sighed, forcing himself to rise, but as he made his way to the bathroom, a familiar wave of sadness washed over him. His eyes lingered on the left sink, Fiona's sink, untouched since her death 2 years ago. The cleaning lady kept it spotless, but Bernard couldn't bring himself to use it. That space belonged to her, and it felt wrong to invade it, even now. Fiona's murder still haunted him. He had left the NYPD to escape the danger and chaos of detective work, to build a new life for his family. But his past had caught up with him, and the price had been her life. He had never been able to shake the guilt, though logically he knew her death wasn't his fault. The knowledge didn't make the pain any easier to bear. Shaking off the melancholy, Bernard showered quickly and dressed, heading downstairs to join his children for breakfast. Tasha and Anthony were already at the table, munching on their sugar-laden cereals, laughing between bites. It was moments like these that kept Bernard grounded. His kids were thriving despite the tragedy, excelling in school and their extracurricular activities. Tasha was a rising star on the debate team and loved drama class. Anthony, on the other hand, was a natural athlete, balancing football, wrestling, and baseball. "Good morning, guys," Bernard greeted them, a smile creeping onto his face. "How are the best kids in America doing?" "Dad," they both chimed in unison, giving him a look that said he was being cheesy. Okay, Bernard chuckled. "The worst kids in America, then." "Dad," they exclaimed again, pushing their chairs back as they stood ready to playfully attack him. "You know you love us," Tasha teased, hands on her hips. "I do, huh? Who told you that?" he asked, raising his hands in mock surrender. "You did," they replied, their laughter filling the room. Just then, the doorbell rang, and his phone buzzed in his pocket. The kids ran off to greet their babysitter, Tanisha, who had arrived to take them to school. Bernard waved at them as they left, already reaching for his phone. The screen flashed with Detective Cynthia Toussaint's name. "Great minds think alike," Bernard said as he answered. "I was just thinking about you." "I wish it were good news," Cynthia's voice came through, tension thick in her words. "But we've got a problem." Bernard's tone shifted immediately. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she assured him, "but we might have a case. Got a minute?" "Yeah, what's going on?" "There was a murder on the 1 train last night," Cynthia explained. "A homeless man. The way he was killed, it's disturbing." Bernard frowned. "A homeless guy? I mean, that's terrible, but isn't that something the precinct should handle?" Cynthia's voice grew grim. "It's not just that he was murdered, Bernie. They carved the N-word into his forehead." Bernard's blood ran cold. His mind flashed back to similar hate crimes he'd seen during his time at the NYPD, but this was something else, brutal, intimate in its cruelty. "And there's more," Cynthia continued. "Whoever did it left no trace, no prints, no DNA, nothing." Bernard was silent for a moment, processing the information. "That's sick," he finally said, his voice low. "But why us? The precinct should be able to handle a hate crime, as horrible as it is." Cynthia sighed. "This isn't the first one. Last month, a Hispanic man was found with the word spike carved into his chest. He was a restaurant owner, not homeless. Someone is targeting minorities, and they're doing it cleanly, with no evidence left behind." Bernard's grip tightened on his phone. Hate was rearing its ugly head again in Manhattan, and this time it seemed methodical, deliberate. He knew what this meant. They had a case. "Get Ramirez," Bernard said, his mind already racing through the possibilities. "Let's meet. We've got work to do." Part 2, The Hunt. Bernard leaned against the hood of his car, staring at the skyline of Lower Manhattan. The city buzzed with life, people going about their business, unaware that somewhere in its depths a monster was lurking. Someone, or some group, was on a rampage, carving hateful words into their victims' flesh and leaving nothing behind but bodies and questions. Bernard had seen his fair share of violence as an NYPD detective, but this was different. It was personal. Cynthia Toussaint's voice crackled over the phone in his hand, pulling him back to the present. "We're heading over to the scene now. Ramirez is already there with the tech team. You coming?" "Yeah," Bernard replied, pushing himself off the car. "I'm on my way. Meet you at the station in 10. He hung up and climbed into his car, his thoughts swirling as he drove toward the 23rd precinct. The murder of the homeless man was bad enough, but when Cynthia mentioned that this was part of a pattern, it set off alarm bells. Someone was targeting minorities, and it wasn't random. It was cold, calculated hate. As he pulled into the station lot, Bernard spotted Cynthia and Detective Hector Ramirez standing by a squad car, their faces grim. Ramirez was tall and broad-shouldered, a former Marine with the posture and attitude to match. His eyes were hidden behind dark aviators, but Bernard knew he was as troubled by this case as the rest. "Morning," Bernard greeted them as he approached. "Not much good about it," Ramirez said, nodding in acknowledgement. "This case just gets uglier by the minute." Cynthia handed Bernard a folder filled with crime scene photos. "We've got something on the victim from last night. His name was Rodney Green. He was a truck driver before losing his job and home. Spent the last year bouncing between shelters. He was last seen alive in Alphabet City before he got on the train. We're still piecing together the details, but whoever did this didn't know him." Bernard flipped through the photos. The images of Rodney Green's body were brutal. His face, covered in dried blood, was nearly unrecognizable, and the hateful slur carved into his forehead made Bernard's stomach twist. "What's the tech team found so far?" Bernard asked, closing the folder. Ramirez shook his head. "Not much. No prints, no fibers, no DNA. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. Clean work, and they're not sloppy about it." "Any witnesses?" Bernard asked, though he already suspected the answer. One guy thought he heard something around Rector Street but didn't see anything. Most people were either asleep or too drunk to notice. It was early morning and the train was nearly empty, Cynthia explained. "That's a pattern too," Bernard mused. "Late night, minimal witnesses. The killer, or killers, pick their moments carefully. They know when and where to strike without being seen." Ramirez crossed his arms. "We've got a hate group, I'm sure of it. This isn't just some random nut job on a spree. They've done this before. Different victims, same MO. Clean kills, racial slurs carved into the body, and no evidence left behind." Bernard nodded. He had been thinking the same thing. The carving suggests it's a message. Not just killing someone, but making sure people know why. They want to incite fear. Cynthia sighed, rubbing her temples. Hate crimes are on the rise, especially in the lower parts of Manhattan. But this, it feels like the start of something bigger. And we're not going to wait around for the next body to show up. Bernard looked out at the city beyond the station. "No, we're going to hunt them down before they can strike again." The next few days were a blur of late nights and dead ends. Bernard, Cynthia, and Hector worked tirelessly, chasing leads and poring over surveillance footage. They interviewed every possible witness, canvassed the neighborhood where Rodney Green had been last seen, and scoured the subway stations for any clue that might point them toward the killers. But the group responsible for these murders was like smoke, impossible to pin down. One evening, as Bernard sat in his office, staring at the scattered case files on his desk, his phone buzzed with a text from Cynthia. "We've got something. Meet me at the precinct." Within minutes, Bernard was in his car, weaving through the evening traffic toward the precinct. When he arrived, Cynthia was waiting for him outside, a look of cautious optimism on her face. "We might have a break," she said, leading him inside. They walked into the tech room, where Ramirez and one of the precinct's tech specialists were hunched over a computer. The screen displayed grainy footage from a subway platform camera. "This is from last night, about 10 minutes before Rodney Green was attacked," Ramirez said, pointing at the screen. The footage showed two figures stepping onto the platform. They were wearing hoodies and kept their heads down, making it hard to see their faces. Both men moved purposefully, scanning the area before disappearing down the stairs. "Is those our guys?" Bernard asked. "We're not sure," Ramirez replied, "but it's the best lead we've got so far. The timestamp lines up, and it looks like they're scoping the place out." "Can you enhance the image?" Bernard asked the tech specialist. "I've already tried," she replied, frustration in her voice. "The footage is too grainy, and the angle is bad. We can't make out his face." Cynthia crossed her arms. "Whoever they are, they're smart. They know how to avoid cameras and keep their faces hidden." Bernard studied the footage for a moment longer. "We need to figure out who these guys are. If we can get a match on those hoodies, it might give us something to work with. Any distinctive features?" Ramirez nodded. "There's a patch on the back. Looks like it's from a local motorcycle club, Iron Fist Riders." Bernard raised an eyebrow. "Iron Fist? That's not just any local MC. They've got connections with white supremacist groups. If these guys are tied to them, we might be looking at something much bigger." Cynthia's eyes widened. "That makes sense. Organized, methodical. If this is part of a larger group, we need to move fast before they strike again." The next morning, Bernard, Cynthia, and Ramirez found themselves at the headquarters of the Iron Fist Riders, a dingy bar in a rundown part of downtown Brooklyn. The smell of stale beer and cigarettes greeted them as they entered, and the few patrons inside glanced up warily. A man in a leather vest with the Iron Fist patch on his back approached them, his eyes narrowing as he looked the three detectives up and down. "You lost?" he growled. Bernard stepped forward, his expression hard. "We're looking for two men. We know they're tied to your crew. You either help us, or we come back with a warrant and tear this place apart." The man sneered, but Bernard's no-nonsense attitude made him think twice about resisting. "Who are you looking for?" Bernard pulled out a photo of the grainy figure from the surveillance footage. "These two. We know they're one of yours." The biker stared at the photo for a moment, then shrugged. "Never seen them before." Ramirez leaned in, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't play games with us. We know this patch is yours, and we know 2 guys in your crew are responsible for the murder of 2 innocent men. Now either you start talking, or we'll make your life real difficult." The biker hesitated, glancing over his shoulder at the other men in the bar, then back at the detectives. His jaw clenched. All right. There's been talk, okay? Some of the newer guys, they've been hanging around with some real nasty folks. Guys who are into that kind of shit. I don't know names, but if you want answers, you'll need to talk to a guy named Vance. He runs the crew out in Alphabet City. Bernard exchanged a glance with Cynthia and Ramirez. They had a lead. As they turned to leave, the biker called after them. "You didn't hear that from me." Outside, Bernard felt a flicker of hope. They were getting closer. The hunt had begun. Part 3. They kill once again. The morning fog clung to the streets of Manhattan like a heavy, oppressive blanket as Bernard, Cynthia, and Hector stood huddled outside the precinct. They had barely slept since their visit to the Iron Fist Riders clubhouse the day before, their minds racing with the new lead, Vance. He was their best shot at identifying the men behind the murders. But Bernard knew better than to believe this hunt would be easy. Hate was a deep-rooted weed, and when you tried to pull it up, it only grew back thicker and more dangerous. Alphabet City isn't exactly the safest place for a field trip, Cynthia muttered, sipping from her coffee cup. Especially not with someone like Vance involved. This guy is connected to real violent players. Hector, ever the pragmatist, was less worried about the location and more focused on the potential danger ahead. "We go in fast, get what we need, and get out. Vance is the kind of guy who's going to have eyes everywhere. If word gets out we're sniffing around, he'll bolt." Bernard nodded. He had dealt with guys like Vance before, men who thrived in the shadows, feeding off fear, operating just beneath the surface of society. The plan was simple. Locate Vance, question him, and see if they could link him to Kevin O'Brien and Ryan Walsh, the likely suspects from the footage. But things were never that easy. "Let's move," Bernard said, his voice steady despite the nagging feeling in his gut that something was about to go terribly wrong. They rolled into Alphabet City in an unmarked car, driving through the maze of narrow streets and crumbling buildings. The sun had barely risen, casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement. This part of the city felt like a different world, a place where survival was a daily battle, and no one trusted anyone. It was a prime breeding ground for hate groups, which is exactly why Vance had set up shop there. As they approached the bar where Vance was known to conduct business, Hector cut the engine, and the 3 of them exited the vehicle, moving with the cautious precision of experienced detectives. The bar itself looked like it had seen better days. The neon sign above flickered in and out of life, and the smell of cheap booze and stale cigarettes seeped through the cracks in the door. Bernard led the way, pushing through the front entrance and into the dimly lit interior. The few patrons scattered around the room looked up briefly, their expressions guarded. Behind the bar, a heavy-set man with a greasy ponytail eyed them warily. "We're looking for Vance," Bernard said without preamble, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "We know he's here." The bartender grunted, clearly unimpressed. "Who's asking?" "Someone who's about to make your life a lot harder if you don't start talking," Hector growled, his imposing frame and no-nonsense demeanor making the threat clear. The bartender hesitated but finally nodded toward the back of the bar, where a door led to a private room. "He's back there, but don't say I didn't warn you. Vance don't like cops." Cynthia smirked. "We're not cops." They moved toward the door, Bernard knocking twice before pushing it open. Inside, a man sat at a table littered with cigarette butts and half-empty beer bottles. Vance was older than Bernard had expected, late 40s, maybe even early 50s, with a face hardened by years of street life. Tattoos crept up his neck and onto his face, and his eyes were cold, calculating. "Who the fuck are you?" Vance asked, his voice gravelly. Bernard didn't bother with pleasantries. "We're looking for 2 of your guys, Kevin O'Brien and Ryan Walsh. We know they're involved in the murders of 2 men on the subway." One of them was Rodney Green. Another was a restaurant owner, and we know they're working with white supremacists. You're going to tell us where they are." Vance leaned back in his chair, a cruel smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You're barking up the wrong tree, Detective. I don't know any Kevin or Ryan, and even if I did, why the hell would I tell you anything?" "You don't scare me." Hector stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. "We're not here to scare you. We're here to end this. You can either help us, or we'll make sure you go down with the rest of them. You think the system will protect you? Hate groups like yours are a dying breed, and if you're smart, you'll see that. Otherwise, we're coming back here with a lot more than just questions." For a moment, Vance looked like he might laugh them off, but then Bernard caught something in his eyes. A flicker of hesitation. Vance wasn't stupid. He knew the tide was turning, that things had gotten more dangerous. Bernard pressed harder. "Think about it, Vance. They're leaving bodies behind. Eventually they'll make a mistake, and when they do, you'll be right there with them. You want to go down for their crimes, or you want to get out of this while you still can?" Vance clenched his jaw, the tension in the room palpable. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice barely more than a growl. "All right. I've heard of them. They're not regulars, but they've been hanging around the club, talking to some of the younger guys, trying to recruit. They're looking for a new member base, and they're targeting loners, the ones looking for a cause." Bernard exchanged a glance with Cynthia. This was exactly what they had feared, a hate group expanding its reach, feeding on disillusionment, anger, and fear. "Where are they now?" Cynthia asked, her voice sharp. Vance hesitated, then finally relented. "Last I heard, they were planning something big. They've been talking about hitting the subway again. They think no one can stop them. That's all I know." Bernard's heart sank. If Kevin and Ryan were planning another attack, they didn't have much time. He turned on his heel, signaling Cynthia and Hector to follow. "Thanks for the tip," Bernard called over his shoulder. "But if you're lying to us, we'll be back. And next time, it won't be so friendly." The subway was packed when Bernard, Cynthia, and Hector arrived at the central control room to brief the officers patrolling the system. They had issued an alert to all units. Kevin and Ryan were planning another attack, and this time they were going to stop them. The city buzzed with oblivious energy, unaware of the hate-fueled storm brewing beneath its streets. Bernard's heart raced as they scanned the subway surveillance feeds, hoping to catch a glimpse of the suspects before they struck again. Then, it happened. A call came through. 2 men, matching the description of Kevin and Ryan, had been spotted on the one train near Times Square, and they were moving fast. Bernard's stomach twisted with dread. They were running out of time. "Let's go," he ordered, sprinting toward the nearest platform. As they boarded the next train, Bernard's mind raced. He had to stop them before they claimed another innocent life. The thought of another victim, another family torn apart by senseless hate, fueled him. This time, there would be no mercy. They reached Times Square just in time to see the train pulling in. Bernard caught a glimpse of 2 figures moving through the crowd. Kevin and Ryan, their faces twisted with the same sick satisfaction he had seen in the crime scene photos. They were heading for the rear of the train, where a young Hispanic man sat alone, oblivious to the danger. "Stop!" Bernard shouted, charging after them. Kevin and Ryan turned, surprise flashing across their faces. But instead of running, they smiled. "Too late, Detective," Kevin sneered, reaching for something inside his jacket. A knife. Bernard's blood turned to ice as he saw the blade glint in the dim subway light. Not this time. With a speed born of desperation, Bernard lunged, grabbing Kevin's wrist before he could strike. The 2 men struggled, fists flying as the train screeched to a halt. Hector tackled Ryan to the ground, wrestling the knife from his hand as Cynthia restrained him. In the chaos, Bernard twisted Kevin's arm, the knife clattering to the floor. He pinned him down, breathing hard, adrenaline surging through his veins. It was over. Later, as Kevin and Ryan were hauled off in cuffs, Bernard leaned against the subway wall, catching his breath. He had stopped them. But the victory felt hollow. The city had been spared another tragedy, but the hate still lingered, simmering just beneath the surface. Bernard knew there would always be another fight, another battle to wage. But for now at least, the streets were a little safer. For now,